A forest blanketed in mist stretched across the land, silent and untouched, filled with the earthy scent of alien blooms and the soft murmur of hidden creatures. Only the occasional flash of luminescent plants broke the dimness, their glow faint yet enough to light a path in the quiet woods. She walked carefully, her footsteps soft on the moss-covered ground, eyes alert and ears tuned to every sound around her. It was peaceful here, in the borderlands of her world, a place most of her kind avoided, deeming it too close to the unknown territories beyond. As she bent to examine a patch of rare plants, a new sound intruded, unfamiliar and out of place. It was a mechanical hum, low and steady, interspersed with clicking noises. She froze, holding her breath. Her heart pounded as her mind raced through all the tales she had heard, all the warnings whispered by the elders about the dangers that lurked beyond the borders. Slowly, she turned toward the sound. Through the mist, she caught sight of a figure. It was unlike anything she'd seen before, taller and bulkier, its form encased in strange layers of fabric and metal, with pale, bare skin in places. It was one of them, the beings her people spoke of with such fear. She had never expected to see one so close, yet here it was, fumbling with a device that blinked with tiny lights. Every instinct in her body told her to flee. Her people had always said that these creatures were dangerous, unpredictable, ruthless. And yet, something held her rooted to the spot. Curiosity sparked within her, mingling with the fear. She watched from behind a thick tree, hoping he wouldn't notice her. But suddenly, he paused, turning his head in her direction. His eyes, strange and piercing, locked onto hers. In that instant, a chill ran through her, and she pressed herself harder against the tree, wishing she could disappear. He took a small step toward her, his expression unreadable. She didn't move, every muscle tensed as she waited, heart pounding, for what he would do next. Instead of advancing with aggression, he raised one hand, palm open, fingers spread, a gesture her people didn't use, but one she'd heard of in stories. A sign of peace. She didn't trust it at first, suspicion flaring in her. But he didn't lower his hand, and there was no trace of threat in his stance. Cautiously, she took a small step from behind the tree, keeping her distance, but allowing herself to observe him more openly. He spoke, his voice low and soft, words incomprehensible to her but lacking any harshness. His tone held a gentleness that caught her off guard. She had expected him to be rough, perhaps angry or impatient. But there was none of that in his voice. Slowly, he knelt down, reaching into a pouch at his side. She stiffened, thinking it might be a weapon, but what he pulled out was small and harmless, a wrapped parcel of something, which he unwrapped and held out toward her. It was food, she realized, the smell foreign but strangely appealing. Curiosity battled with her fear, and hunger had its own voice in the back of her mind. She hadn't eaten since morning, and the offering tempted her. He remained still, waiting, his hand outstretched, the food resting on his palm. She took a cautious step closer, her gaze flicking from his face to the food and back, watching for any sign of danger. When she was within reach, she extended a hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she took the food from him. His expression softened, and he nodded as if encouraging her to eat. Slowly, she took a small bite, the taste unfamiliar but rich, different from anything she had known. They stood in silence for a while, watching each other with mutual curiosity. The fear began to fade, replaced by a tentative understanding that neither of them could quite put into words. She realized in that moment that he was not the monster her people had warned her about. He was something else, something she didn't yet understand, but that didn't feel like a threat. She took another step closer, emboldened by his gentle manner. And as they shared a moment in the misty forest, two beings from distant worlds found common ground in their silent exchange. The human kept his gaze steady, but there was no trace of impatience or hostility. Instead, his eyes held an almost childlike wonder. He shifted slightly, moving in a way that allowed her to observe him more closely without feeling intimidated. His skin was strange to her, a shade her people didn't possess, with odd patches of hair on his face and head. His clothes were rough and well-worn, clearly suited for travel, though they bore signs of recent hardship, frayed edges, dirt smudges, and a faint tear along one sleeve. Slowly, she found herself mirroring his earlier gesture, raising her own hand, palm facing him. She wasn't sure if it held the same meaning for her as it did for him, but she wanted to show that she understood he meant no harm. His expression brightened, a hint of a smile touching his lips, and he raised his hand to match hers, hovering in the air, a short distance from her own. For a moment, they stood like that, hands nearly touching, each absorbed in the silent exchange. She could feel the warmth of his hand radiating through the air, and the sensation was oddly comforting. Her fear melted further, replaced by an inexplicable connection she didn't fully understand. In her world, such close proximity was reserved only for those one trusted deeply, yet here she was, drawn to this strange being who defied every story she had ever been told. He gestured to a small patch of moss nearby, motioning for her to sit. She hesitated, glancing around the forest, as if searching for reassurance. When she looked back at him, his gaze was steady, patient. Taking a slow breath, she lowered herself onto the soft ground, watching as he did the same across from her. They sat in silence, observing each other with mutual fascination. Then, he reached into his pack once more, pulling out a small device, a simple tool, it seemed, one that produced a series of soft, chime-like sounds. Her eyes widened in wonder at the noise, a melody that sounded gentle and inviting. The sounds drifted through the air, filling the clearing with a kind of magic she hadn't anticipated. It was a song, she realized, though unlike any her people made. She leaned forward slightly, entranced by the delicate music that seemed to dance around them. The human watched her reaction with a smile, and for the first time, she felt a strange warmth in her chest, a spark of understanding that words couldn't capture. She realized that he, too, was curious about her world, eager to share a piece of his in return. Encouraged, she reached to her own side, where a small, woven pouch hung from her belt. Inside, she kept a smooth stone, polished by years of use, that was used in her own culture's music rituals. She took it out and began tapping it softly against another stone nearby, creating a steady rhythm. His eyes lit up, clearly delighted by her response, and he adjusted his instrument's chime to follow her beat. Together, they created a simple song, blending the foreign sounds into something harmonious. The forest seemed to come alive around them, as if the trees and plants themselves were listening. In that moment, it was as if no borders or differences separated them. She forgot her fears and the warnings of her elders, allowing herself to be swept up in the strange beauty of their shared music. When the melody faded, they sat in comfortable silence, their breaths mingling with the mist that hovered in the cool air. She didn't know what would happen next or what this encounter would mean for her life, but for now, that didn't matter. He reached out once more, this time extending a small, round object, a smooth, reflective sphere that caught the dim light and reflected it in an array of colors. She took it carefully, feeling the coolness of the glass against her fingers. It was beautiful, unlike anything she'd ever seen. She held it up to the light, watching as colors danced across its surface, and she couldn't help but smile. In return, she pulled a small charm from her belt, a simple pendant made of carved wood, something she had carried since childhood. She held it out to him, her gaze hopeful. He accepted it with a quiet, grateful nod, tucking it safely into his pocket. As they exchanged these small tokens, she realized that her entire understanding of the world had shifted in the span of an afternoon. The human in front of her was not a conqueror or a warrior. He was simply someone kind, someone who saw her as she was, without the weight of all the old stories and fears that had been taught to her. When the faint sound of voices in the distance interrupted the peace, he looked toward the noise, his expression tightening. It was his people, no doubt, searching for him. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name, regret, perhaps, or the silent wish that this moment could last a little longer. She understood. This strange, beautiful moment would have to end. As he rose to leave, He pointed to the small sphere she held in her hand and then gestured toward his chest, as if telling her to keep it as a reminder of their meeting. She nodded, clutching it close, her heart heavy with the bittersweet knowledge that they might never meet again. And as he disappeared into the mist, she remained where she was, clutching the smooth sphere and feeling the warmth of their connection linger, long after he was gone. Days passed, yet the memory of that encounter lingered in her mind like a haunting melody. She found herself returning to the borderlands, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, listening for the soft chime of his music or the faint hum of human technology. Her heart ached with a mix of longing and confusion. She had spent her life fearing the unknown, yet now she found herself entranced by it, wondering if perhaps there was more to the galaxy than her people's stories. One evening, as the sky blazed with the twin moons of her world, she heard footsteps on the path. Her heart skipped, and she quickly ducked behind a tree. But when she peered around the trunk, she recognized the figure instantly. He had returned, a familiar warmth in his eyes as he spotted her. He smiled, and she felt her own face soften in response, a mix of joy and relief washing over her. She stepped forward, and without words, they fell into a silent understanding, as if those days apart had only deepened their connection. He extended his hand toward her, and this time, without hesitation, she took it. Together, they walked through the misty woods, letting the silence between them speak. As they walked, he pulled out a small book from his pack, flipping through the pages to reveal pictures of places she had never seen, vast deserts, towering mountains, endless oceans. Each image held a piece of his world, and he watched her face light up with wonder at the sight. In return, she led him to a grove of crystalline plants that glowed in vibrant shades of violet and teal. She showed him the way the plants responded to touch, lighting up with a pulsing glow. He reached out, brushing his fingers across the petals, his eyes wide with amazement. For hours, they exchanged these silent gifts, sharing pieces of themselves in ways words could never convey. And in those moments, her world felt bigger, more beautiful than it ever had before. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a sharp sound echoed through the trees, a call from her people, urgent and unmistakable. She looked up, the weight of reality crashing back over her. The elders would be furious if they found her here with him. For a brief, agonizing moment, she wanted to ignore the call, to stay in this strange, beautiful world they had created together. He seemed to understand, his gaze filled with a quiet sadness. He nodded, as if accepting the inevitable, and let go of her hand. Before he could turn to leave, she took the sphere he had given her and held it out to him, pressing it into his hand. Then, from around her neck, she took a small pendant, a piece of carved stone with intricate patterns, a symbol of protection from her people. She placed it in his hand, closing his fingers over it. He looked down at the pendant, then back at her, his eyes bright with gratitude and something she could only describe as warmth, as if the gift meant more than words could convey. In return, he tucked a small metal token into her palm, a piece of his own world, a fragment of a ship's insignia, something that would allow her to remember him as vividly as she remembered their time together. As they parted, she watched him disappear into the twilight, his figure growing smaller with each step. The ache in her chest grew, but she knew this was goodbye. She would never forget him, nor the way he had shown her a world beyond her own. Back at her village, she faced the questioning gazes of her kin, the disapproving stares of the elders. But her heart was at peace, fortified by the memory of the human who had shattered her fears and shown her the beauty of the unknown. She no longer saw the galaxy as a place of endless threats, but as a place of endless possibility. The pendant he had given her remained with her, a tangible reminder of the encounter. And as the years passed, she shared her story with her people, not a story of danger, but one of curiosity, courage, and the profound understanding she had found in the silence between two strangers. And though she never saw him again, in her heart, he was always there, a bright star in the vast, starlit void of her memories.